Welcome to the CentralReach ABA On-Call podcast.
We do insist upon quick reinforcement.
Thought-provoking conversation, ideas, and trends in the applied behavior analysis industry.
With this type of arrangement of material, you can learn the same amount in about half the time with half the effort.
Now, here are your hosts, Drs. Rick Cabina and Doug Kostowitz.
Well, Doug, we have yet another fabulous podcast coming. And this time we have two guests that I just can't wait to talk with these two folks. We're going to be talking about supervision, one of your topics that you and I both know a little bit about, but not a lot about.
Yeah, not as much as other aspects to the BCBA and becoming certified, but I'm very excited for the conversation today.
Yeah, and I should point out to all of our listeners that at the time of this recording, we are all experiencing the COVID-19 epidemic, and our topic happens to be supervision in the digital age. And now, the BCBA, ABAI, everyone is providing guidance on remote and how do you do things with telehealth. So this is an incredibly timely interview with our two guests. And we have Dr. Lisa Britton and Matt Cicoria. And both of these two fine colleagues have written an amazing book called Remote Fieldwork Supervision for BCBA Trainees. And I would like to welcome Matt and Lisa to the show.
Hey, Rick. Hey, Doug.
Hey.
Thanks for inviting us.
Hi, guys. It's great to be here.
Well, let's start off with a question that would, I think, let me take a step back. Looking at your book, you have a lot of great chapters. And when Doug and I were reading over your book, we had so many questions, but we thought, okay, let's just kind of break it down and ask some basic questions. And the first question that we have for you two is, why should a behavior analyst choose to supervise another behavior analyst? So ground, right at the beginning, at the ground floor, why should that happen?
Matt, I'm going to put you on the spot because you actually wrote the introduction, and I think you highlighted some of those specific things quite nicely. So I'm going to have you jump into this first.
Deal. Should be noted that I wrote the shortest chapters in the book. That one is no exception. Anyway, two things, I was thinking of in answering this question, and I may or may not hit all the points that I listed in that chapter. But the two big ones that come to mind is, when I interviewed my graduate mentor, Jim Johnston, for the podcast many years ago, we were talking about the behavior analyst obligation to the field. And that's something you hear Jim talk about quite a bit. And someone mentioned a stat the other day. I don't know how accurate it is, but at least it feels that way, in that we have almost 40,000 BCBAs walking around the planet these days. And I think I heard something to the effect that almost half of them have only been certified in the last 5 years.
That's right.
So we're in this massive acceleration. I don't know, perhaps if that's the correct word, guys, of certificates here. The majority of whom have been practicing 5 years or less, or at least been certified. Many of them, of course, have been practicing longer than that. In a non-certified context. So, I think especially, for those of us who've been hanging around this field for a little while, there's some, responsibility from that perspective. And I'm not a big believer in that length of time in a given occupation alone is the sole identifier or signifier of competence, certainly. There's some excellent behavior analysts who are just, doing really good work, who are newly minted. So I don't want to paint with a broad brush here, but at the same time, the large majority of practitioners are those with very, just a few years of experience. So particularly for those of us with a little gray around the temples. I think, in my case, a little bit more than that. I think, we have the obligation to supervise. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking like, I should probably supervise more than I am right now. So that would be one reason. The second reason is that supervising, I think, makes you a better practitioner in general. And so that would be the other thing that I've learned over the years. And that can happen in two ways. One, certainly, for me, in my experiences, it's been very stimulating intellectually, talking with a BCBA trainee as they're going through their coursework and, just hearing their experiences, hearing them make those kind of aha connections, but also helping them solve problems. And so from that standpoint, it's both fun and it also, kind of keeps you sharp, especially if you're supervising someone who does stuff that's a little bit different than what your day-to-day is. So I think there's that aspect of it. And then, I don't know if it's me, but I've been so lucky to have just awesome people to supervise. I end up learning a lot from them because, again, they oftentimes come from a different line of work or a different, kind of philosophical orientation or what have you. And, I have benefited as much as that, from the experience just as much as they have. So, so those would be two big reasons that I would think of off the top of my head. And, maybe there's more that I wrote about that I can't recall right now, but
no, those are really
good enough.
Those are two really good reasons. And building on that, do you see that there's qualities that make for a good supervisor, and in turn, maybe qualities that may not make someone really ideal for supervision?
Can I jump in on that one?
Please.
I would say, I've been looking at, unfortunately, there isn't a ton of literature out there related to supervision, but some of the work that has come out, like what Tyra Sellers talks about and Linda LeBlanc and several of their colleagues, is really being able to develop a relationship with your trainee and how critical that is. And so that they feel comfortable telling you what they don't know and what they need additional support with. And also they feel comfortable being able to tell you what you need to do a little differently in order for them to be able to build their skill set fully. And I think that such an important component of being a good supervisor is those relationship building skills and having people feel comfortable enough to talk to you about the things that they need to talk to you about.
I love that answer because our science is vast, and myself in particular, I don't know everything about verbal behavior. I know about it in general. I've taught the course before, but if someone were to ask me something really nuanced, I might not know about that. Or maybe someone's interested in relational frame theory. So that idea of having a good relationship and being open and scientific, I think that's really worth noting.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, let me ask another question. If you're going to dip your foot or jump in full-time, dip your toe, I guess is the right metaphor. If you're going to dip your toe into supervision, or if you're going to do it full-time, does it have to be a full-time job, or can you do it part-time?
I would say most people doing supervision do it part-time. There are exceptions. And Lisa, you could probably speak to that, obviously. But I'm sure there's many, the large majority of practitioners doing supervision are doing that as part of their responsibilities as otherwise assigned, or what's that contractual language, and other duties as assigned that most people have in their employee contracts.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Matt, in terms of, that's definitely a component of what people need to be doing when they are providing support within an agency. And then in the event that you're doing this as a side gig, then obviously you still have to pay the bills. And so the likelihood of having enough trainees to be able to support a full-time position, that's something that definitely took me a long time to ramp up in that fashion, and to be able to have the systems in place to be able to do that effectively, because I think it's a lot easier to have quality control in place when you're supervising one or two folks. But if you're supervising several people, you have to have systems that are going to allow you to track who's done what within the task list, who has met competency in which areas, and what's next for them.
Is there a number that suggests I have too many supervisees? Because I mean, we've all heard stories of some people taking on too many, but do you have general guidance on that?
I don't, and I think you look at the board; they don't have specific language about that, and I think that's intentional in the sense that it's going to vary based off of the other responsibilities that somebody has within their job description. So for some people, 0 is the right number, quite honestly, because they have a huge caseload, they have a lot of responsibilities, and taking on a trainee is just going to be beyond what they can do. And for other people, if that is their sole task, either within an agency or with the work that they're doing on their own, then obviously they can take on several people, assuming that they have the systems in place to be able to do that.
Okay, so we understand what qualities make a supervisor, what some of the situations that maybe you shouldn't have any supervisors because you have too much work to do. Let's move on to the next segment, and that is, what is remote supervision? How would you define it? And what differentiates it or similarities to traditional models of supervision?
So in my opinion, I think that in-person supervision and remote supervision should look very similar. It's a matter of the tasks that we are working on and aligning to the things that people need to be able to do within their scope of practice at the point when they are ready to sit for the exam. But the difference is then, how are we examining those work outputs and their ability to, say, conduct a stimulus preference assessment effectively, or reviewing a functional behavior assessment report to ensure that it covers all of the steps that need to be there.
So then, one thing I have supervision at my university. I'm in charge of that aspect, and we have mostly group and in-person supervision. I was wondering, one of our options that's been available to us is taping something, then working with that individual remotely on tape. So you're not actually seeing them in the moment actually working with them. You're giving them that feedback later. I was wondering if you could speak to that kind of the relationship in time. So you're not actually seeing them, but you kind of give that feedback later on. If that's maybe poses some difficulty, or you don't see that.
I think that poses two different types of difficulties, and I'll speak to one and I'll hand off the other to Lisa, and I'm sure she probably has a whole host of thoughts on these. But the first thing, and we talk about this in the book, is that especially with these days, it's so easy to capture video with like an iPhone or something like that. Mm-hmm. You have to really attend to the privacy needs, and both whether it's a school setting, so you're attending to FERPA, or a healthcare setting where there's HIPAA involved. So what if you're going to be doing any type of media creation? There needs to be a plan around that. You need to be using. The storage of those, media files needs to be secure, and there needs to be protocols about, what happened. I'm not going to get into chapter and verse about what you need to do with that, but because there's that information can be found elsewhere. But you have to make sure that you're not just recording something on your phone or doing something over FaceTime or something like that, because a lot of these remote video platforms are insecure, or at least not secure enough from a HIPAA standard. So that would be logistical consideration, and certainly there's some clinical ones I would that are there as well.
When you're doing remote, is there a toolkit that, a digital toolkit? I mean, what does that mean to do remote? Is it just, Skype or Zoom, or do I need to be set up some way? What are the things now that we're talking about doing this digitally that would be common among people doing remote supervision?
I think what Matt really highlighted is going to be critical in terms of making sure that we are, utilizing tools that are going to protect confidentiality and privacy of the clients themselves, as well as the trainee. And one of the things that we do talk about within the book and that I like to highlight is that my supervisees are my clients. And so I need to protect their confidentiality in the same way that Matt protects the confidentiality of the students that he's responsible for consulting with. And so I think those are things that we need to consider. And the other thing that we need to consider is, when I'm setting up my session, I'm not doing that in a coffee shop, but also, I know that, but does my trainee know that? And so I've had situations where somebody is like, oh, I had to work late, and so I'm over at Starbucks. And I'm like, okay, well, let's reschedule because that's not a place that we can be running our session in.
And can I just piggyback on that? When we say that sort of thing out loud, everyone's like, well, of course. That makes total sense. Don't do, fill in the blank in the Starbucks or the Panera Bread. I would challenge the listener. I mean, you can't do it now that everyone's kind of quarantined, but when this dust settles and life kind of hopefully goes back to normal, hopefully soon, go to a Starbucks, go to it during the workday if you have an opportunity, and sit and just listen to people and meet. I have overheard the most personal stuff imaginable. I remember too. I remember being on the little light rail train from the Denver International Airport to downtown Denver at the last ABAI when it was there, and there was a doctor talking to a patient in the seat right in front of me, and talking about like this bad outcome of their surgery and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy, clearly is not attending to anything close to HIPAA. And then he's talking about it with his companion and after the call got, after he hung up on the call and things like that. So I guess the long story short here is that, you think of these things and it's like, oh, no one ever does that. It happens all the time. So, it's just something to be aware of.
So confidential, let's say we take care of all the confidentiality aspects. That was a lot of syllables. Do you feel that when you're doing the remote supervision and it's delayed, so instead of watching it at that same moment, you're watching recordings in a proper way and you're giving feedback in a proper way, is there any loss of interaction? Is there anything that you feel that perhaps because you had to wait a day or two later? So I was getting at that kind of immediacy. But then also, in addition to that, is can supervisors mix and match if possible? Or should you sort of get everyone used to the same type across one sort of semester or session?
So I would say that anytime you can do in-person supervision, that is preferred. And that is because you can catch some of those nuances that you can't necessarily catch in a recording. Like, wow, it looks like your eye gaze was directed towards the correct stimulus during a discrete trial session. And I may or may not be able to catch that with a video recording. Also, you have the opportunity to catch those less contrived situations that happen in terms of interactions with staff or interactions with parents and so forth that you just can't catch when you are not there with that individual shoulder to shoulder. But in terms of The delivery of feedback, for the most part, I find that it's pretty seamless, and you're reviewing the recording and the video together. So although maybe they did that recording yesterday and now we're looking at it together today, because we're looking at it together and we could say, okay, let's pause here. Let's take a look at this. I really like how you did X, and maybe next time you should do Y a little bit differently. And so I think because you're still able to examine that together, you're still able to have that immediacy in terms of viewing that that aspect as you're going along. And what I also find is that people are, when they are looking at themselves engaging in a task, they're able to pick up on some things that they don't notice when they're doing it in the moment. So they notice that that they're maybe looking at the correct stimulus when they're doing that discrete trial, where they didn't realize that they were doing it in the moment.
So I have to ask this question. This is something you both probably get a lot. If you're looking for someone who does supervision remotely or even in person, how do you get that person?
Wow, that's a good question. Honestly, I don't really have a great answer for it personally. Usually, from what I see, is that people get referrals through their own network or through their own kind of university training programs or verified course sequence programs or what have you. So sometimes I'll get an email out of the blue and say, someone in my program, suggests I reach out to you or something like that. So that's, I guess that's what I would say to that. But yeah, I think it's going to vary based off of, there's probably countless different answers to that, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, that's one of the things that I track is, how did you hear about me? And what I find is that people really struggle with utilizing the BACB registry to find supervisors that, although, a lot of people indicate, yes, I'm willing to supervise. When people reach out through that format, I think that, I don't know if it's just, people are inundated with emails and things like that, but that doesn't seem to be a successful strategy for folks. But what I find is that a lot of people find me through Facebook, through the Behavioral Observations podcast, through internet searches, and through university recommendations. Is probably, those are the most common.
So you published this book, Remote Fieldwork Supervision for BCBA Trainees. Since publishing this, what are some lessons you've learned about remote supervision that may go above and beyond or have further cemented what you've written about? Just any thoughts since that?
Meaning, like, what will we add now if we had an opportunity again?
Right.
For the second edition.
The second edition. Yeah. Yes. Oh boy. I don't know. I have to think about that. I don't know. What would you say, Lisa?
I don't know that I have specifics in terms of what I've learned since the book, but I will say that I learn something new every day that I do supervision. Things that I think that, I kind of think about Megan Miller and the Do Better movement, and how we all need to really think about, I can do things as well as I can today, but I can learn something today and do something better tomorrow. And I think that we all need to have that philosophy, whether we're doing supervision or we're doing clinical work or anything, in terms of how can we up our game and do better for our clients and our trainees. And so I'll take an example. I did a training not so long ago on punishment. And within that training, there was one reference to counter control. And everybody in the group was like, well, what's counter control? And I thought, wow, okay, I didn't realize that was a need area. And so now I need to revamp that training so that I can have a section specifically on counter control. And we can think, well, that's on the universities to provide that training and that information. But if somebody doesn't have a good understanding of counter control and they're thinking about using a punishment procedure, that's problematic because they're not going to be accounting for the responses coming from their client as a result of implementing that intervention.
That's a great point. One of your other chapters that I noticed, you talk about what's on the task list, which we all need to know. But then you have this really cool chapter that is beyond the task list. How did you come up with those areas, and what is your advice to supervisors and to supervisees? Like, how much time do they spend on it? How far do you go with your supervision? I think I asked you like 4 questions there. So take any one of them.
Yeah, I think we felt it was important to have that chapter in there just because there's especially, we were writing this book like 2 years ago, Lisa, something like that, 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, it took us like a year, I think, to write it, or from the I don't know. It seemed it was quite a while, and at the time, that's when all the ACT started becoming really popular, and obviously, acceptance commitment therapy has been around for a long time, but it started becoming more widely discussed in traditional behavior analytics circles. Same thing with relational frame theory. At the same time, and I know this is near and dear to you guys, is that the whole nixing of precision teaching from the task list. And we felt that was important information for certificates or potential BCBAs to know, regardless of whether it was on a task list or not, because of its, because of those things that, we like about measuring in that way. Or at least at the very least, the idea is not necessarily to do a full treatise on all these things, but rather like these are other things that are going on in the field, and there's more to behavior analysis than the white book or what's just in the white book. So, I mean, at least that was my thought. Lisa, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that was at least my point of view when we were writing that chapter.
Yeah, I agree with all those points. And, it isn't where something's not on the 5th edition task list, so now it's no longer behavior analytic. That would be ridiculous. And so I think that we both felt really strongly that we needed to have some information that is going to help folks that are working with maybe some populations that we don't typically think of, making sure that those people who are working with maybe individuals with an emotional or behavioral disorder, they have the tools to be effective with those individuals. So, things like curriculum-based measures and how to use direct instruction and ACT, as you pointed out, and, using precision teaching to evaluating the effectiveness of your academic strategies that you're implementing. And Adele's work related to executive function skills. Those are key skills that people need to have when they're working with somebody other than the typical early intervention autism program.
So what I'm hearing from you both is that there certainly is room for going off the grid, so to speak, and talking about other important parts of either behavior analysis or education or measurement in general. How often can you do that? Or like, is there a point in time where let's say you had a supervisee who's really interested in ACT, how do you balance that with the other things that you have to cover?
From just speaking from my own experience, that's going to depend on the supervisee and where their skill set is. For example, I'm supervising someone right now who I have no doubt that the task list stuff is, she's got that stuff down. So, and this is not a remote supervision situation. I've worked directly with her. So from my perspective, it gives us the time, that buys us more time to talk about some of these things that are perhaps, as you say, off the grid. Whereas if you had a trainee who is struggling to learn the basic steps, if you will, or the basic concepts and principles, then you spend less time on that stuff. And also, someone's interest and job area will play a role in that as well. So if you have someone working at in an alternative school for kids who are at risk or with emotional behavioral disorders, some of the other stuff that Lisa and I just talked about will be more rather than less important. Because at the end of the day, obviously we want people to pass the test, but we want to create effective practitioners.
Well said.
Well, we're approaching the end of our podcast, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to is there anything that, I know there's a lot of other things we can talk about, but is there anything really critical, especially since you two have literally written the book? What should listeners, whether you're a supervisor or a supervisee, what are some really big, important things that are people, either supervisor or supervisees, should be paying attention to if they're going to do this thing called remote supervision?
Do you want me to take that, or you want to go for it?
You can go.
So I think this applies regardless of the modality of supervision. So one of the things I try to do when I'm talking with someone about the potential of supervising is I try to be as transparent as possible to tell them all the things I stink at. And there are many areas. So in other words, I'm being kind of silly here just to make the point, but basically you have to cultivate an awareness of the things you feel relatively confident in, and conversely, the things that you are, kind of like how you open the show, Rick, saying, you've taught verbal behavior, but if someone really wants to, get into the weeds about autoclitics and things like that, you're going to, you might need to defer to someone else who with more expertise. So if someone came to me and their passion was working with preschoolers with autism, in a very specific, with let's say, I don't know, using some sort of curriculum that I'm not familiar with, I would have to let them know that, hey, that's not a population I do a ton of work with, and either try to talk them out of me supervising them, or at least have them, kind of know what they're getting into. So I think it's cultivating an awareness of the things, the known knowns and the known unknowns, or whatever that whole way of conceptualizing your knowledge base. So spend some time thinking about that.
I think that those are all great points, Matt, and kind of along the same lines. As opposed to talking about it from the perspective of the supervisor, I would talk about it from the perspective of the trainee, where I encourage trainees to reach out to multiple folks and interview potential supervisors and really have a conversation about what they are looking for within their supervision. I mean, what I tell the people that I work with is, I'm kind of your employee in a way. And it's this really weird balance of, I guess, power in a sense, where I have, a huge responsibility in terms of the service that I'm delivering to that consumer. And they need to realize that responsibility that I have for them as well. And if I'm not giving them what they need, it's their right to let me know.
Well, Lisa and Matt, you two said it all. That was an absolute excellent set of responses. And Doug and I would certainly like to thank you for taking your time to talk with us. And we'd also, again, like to give a shout out to all of our listeners. And that is, if you don't have this on your shelf, go out and get this now. And like everyone else, we now have more reading time. And the book is Remote Fieldwork Supervision for BCBA Trainees.
They make great gifts too.
Everybody and their friends needs a copy.
That's right. Yeah, I always encourage trainees to buy them as gifts for the supervisors, and then watch what they do as they try to figure out whether they should accept it or not. Just a little test. I'm kidding, of course.
Well, on behalf of Doug, thank you everyone for joining us on ABA On Call.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the CentralReach ABA On Call podcast with Drs. Rick Cabina and Doug Hostowitz.
This is verbal behavior, and
You can find the show notes for this episode on centralreach.com/ABA On Call. Please stay connected with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by following @CentralReach and subscribe on the podcast player of your choice.